Good morning, guys. We're live here on another session for CISA's Re-envisioning Vocational Education. Today I have two distinguished guests, Andrew Scotford and Brett Walker. Fortunately, Troy isn't able to be with us today for some personal reasons. And yeah, we'll start talking about vocational education. Generations of tradespeople and skilled workers have successfully developed their skills and knowledge in a practical work-based learning environment, including international students nowadays. For decades, vocational education and training has been one of the key pillars of Australia's economic success story, and it remains an effective and efficient way of imparting the skills needed for employment, especially for international students under the sector. If anything, it's likely that work-based learning models will be more important in the future as technology-driven changes to the way we do things need to be quickly transmitted across industries and around workplaces. Our fast-moving world will need flexible and applied ways of learning so people can lay strong foundations for their careers and build further skills and knowledge in order to participate in new and changing industries. But with the recent effects of COVID-19 pandemic affecting our industry, it forced us to create a new norm and make necessary changes to cater to health risk. With this in place, will this be a hindrance to developing the future of vocational education, or will it be the spark for re-envisioning of the sector? So Andrew, what type of training delivery methods that we have before that will be relevant now and in the next decade, given the fact that there's issues with COVID recently?
Well, I think obviously the pandemic is going to allow all areas to, re-envision how to best service the needs going forward. But I think the exciting thing in the TAFE sector that I can speak about with reasonable authority is the even increased focus on understanding the absolute needs and requirements of the customers. Customers now, customers of the future, whether those be students, whether they be industry, and whether they be emerging industries. So sometimes we're talking about skill sets for industries that are yet to employ, but are the kind of skills that people will need to have to be working in those industries for the future. So, the mix around sort of blended style learning was probably becoming a little bit more of the norm anyway. But obviously the acceleration that's been created by having to be online, particularly in this over the last sort of 3 months, has, heightened how do we do that mix. But again, that mix will continue to be modified, and I think specialised depending on the industry. Where vocational training has its strength is the real practical nature, and many TAFEs and a lot of other organisations that are in the similar space have had to work through conditions to ensure they're still being able to do a lot of that physical training, but in the modified restrictions that happen at different states at different times over the last little while. But I think the key message that I want to talk about is a vet is really well positioned to understand and move really quickly, to understand how to deliver. And I think Brett would probably agree with me in this, and Troy would have if he'd been here, around they're doing this practical training is probably like a hidden gem that not a lot of international students are aware of the value of. In my opinion, it's a quicker and more efficient way to get the practical skills needed to deliver. And the challenge for international students is to understand how that can benefit them if they're taking those skills specifically back to their country. That cohort of students will need to be probably better educated as to how it's about for their skill set when they return, rather than just the enhanced qualifications of a well-regarded degree or well-regarded training.
All right. Yeah, that's a good point there. I think, the vet sector is really well positioned in case of, any changes or any sort of issues coming in, because it's really up to the private sector. It's privately, most of this sector is on private institutions, so they can actually modify, in a way, right away, if in case they need to adapt to like online or to any sort of system that might be suitable for the vet or for any skills. Any thoughts on that, Brett?
Thank you, Michael. I guess just as an opening comment, in terms of this changing environment, in many ways it's kind of been a test case or a real life pilot on just how adaptive the education sector can be. And often we can be complacent in terms of the way pedagogy moves, training and development moves, learning methodologies move, because they've been, I guess, working and well known. Speaking firstly from English language and English language training, we have been, I'd say, the most structured in terms of learning methodology, and particularly within Australia, the requirements of English language study being that face-to-face, the intensive nature of the course requiring the 20 hours face-to-face learning, supplemented throughout that period with other learning experiences and life experiences, but that face-to-face teaching component has been the core element. The COVID experience and the challenges that it's presented, in many ways we saw probably 10 years of innovation in about 10 days, moving from what was somewhat rigid teaching and learning frameworks to adapting to the virtual and more digital type frameworks. Now, I think to the point Andrew made, that blended learning style and what one of the outcomes of this the pandemic experience will be, I guess, more of an appreciation for the ability to navigate into blended learning styles. And what I think will be really interesting as we work through these challenges and get to the other side will be going back and measuring what the student experience has been like, from both the beginning of this experience to as providers have learned and adapted as well. But actually measuring what some of the positive and negative outcomes have been through the lessons learned throughout this experience. On the positive side, I think some of the adaptability in terms of the learning approaches, some of the flexibility in timetabling and course design, and ways in which providers have aimed to meet the challenges faced by students, working remotely. I think we need to try and grab hold of that. Similarly, some of the challenges, as organisations have evolved very quickly in terms of adapting, particularly in English language delivery, to that online and blended learning approach. It's probably not all been smooth sailing from the start, but we need to understand where adaptations have been made and how we can work with that moving forward. To your point, I think that it's both a public and private sector opportunity, and the way in which both in Australia, our private sector in vocational education and training, as well as that coupled with sort of public sector delivery and needs. I think we have to sort of look at that entire ecosystem of where the opportunity will exist, and somewhat, I think it's a really pivotal time for us to think how we could re-envisage that vocational education delivery across all of our training and education providers.
All right, thanks, Brad. Yeah, I like that point that with the pandemic, the upgrade, or like when we have to, for 10 years, we just made it for like 10 days. It was really great opportunity. But other than the pandemic, what sort of other challenges that vet sector need to face for the future? Andrew?
Well, I think the pandemic, a bit to Brett's point, has really accelerated some of the conversations that we would like to have had anyway, and are aware that you need to continue to have. So the opportunity now is to be very clear in the partnerships that you create to make sure you deliver outcomes for those. So where the vet sector has probably had its strength is around the deep connection it has with industry, and I guess that the short nature of the relationship between the training environment and moving into employment has been sort of, I guess, a bit more of a hallmark of the vet sector. So now there's opportunity to ensure that absolutely occurs in a delivery form that the industry is going to require. Because I think students will want to have a little bit more confidence that their training is going to get them somewhere, rather than necessarily, training because it's the next thing you do after you finish school.
Yeah.
So I think people will be making more astute decisions around that. I think also people will be deciding how much time do they want to invest in their training prior to getting into employment. The concept of will you be still deciding to make a 3 to 5 year training investment prior to entering any sort of sustainable employment? And if you are going to make that investment, you want to have a lot more confidence that it's going to move into employment, or you're going to get value for that money. So, and value for that time and investment. So that's where I think VET can be very clear for the areas that you want to get into, or as I often talk about, you currently know you want to get into. We all know that people will pivot their careers on average 5 times, and with up to 15 employers. So, but where you are right now, I think it's important for VET to be very clear as to how they can support the student's pathway to that employment outcome or that learning outcome. And that's the challenge that VET's always had. And now it's an opportunity just to be very clear, and particularly very clear for international students, how that can be an asset for them, whether they want to be a world employable citizen, whether they want to use that as part of their migration path to this country, or whether they just want to improve their skills and employability in their home country. Having greater clarity around that, because it's got proven evidence of their connection to the next step you want to get to, is where VETs already needs to think about, and we'll just have this enhanced focus, as will industry, as will students. And I think a bit to Brett's point, we're doing very clear as to gathering information regularly and currently from particularly students to understand how that is visible and accessible for them.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, I totally agree with that. As a VET student myself, it's really important to be updated with regards to what the employers actually want, specifically in Northern Territory or in whatever state you are, or even in the world. So I think it's really important that VET institutions, private or public, should really be at par, at least in the world level. Any other challenges that you may have thought, Brett?
Yeah, I guess in some ways it's whether the challenges do, I guess, lead to the opportunity. I mean, if we look currently in Australia, there's a lot of focus on the growing unemployment levels, and the highest unemployment, I think, in the last 20 or more years now, in terms of where Australia is at, and facing looming greater unemployment in ratios here in Australia. That's also, I think we need to think in the context of what's happening globally. And throughout this situation, it's going to really, I think, refocus attention on education to employment outcomes, which was, I think, a cornerstone of what Andrew was sort of noting as well. And that link, that I think direct link with employer needs. So understanding during these changes, what are the needs of the employers, and how does the vocational education sector react? How does it look to evolve what's being delivered to meet the needs of the employer groups as well? But if anything, I think history has shown that during any sort of global recession, during pandemic periods or other market declines, there's generally been a rebound into education across all levels of education. There is going to be a need for upskilling and retraining. And I think that some of the attributes within the vocational education sector, being that closer alignment with certainly straight into the employment or on-the-job training, I think that's going to provide a real opportunity for the sector to be able to meet the needs for those people that are either here looking to join industries in Australia or within their own nations back home. And I think we need to have that, that real line of sight between Australia as a beacon for education, but still a small minority of that actually remain as residents of Australia. So we do need to be conscious of what are the skills needs and transformational skill needs for the student cohort that are coming to Australia for education experience, but still need to be able to take that skill back home.
All right, thanks, Brett. I have a question here coming from a stakeholder. The the question is, there is a debate about the role of micro-credentials. What do these look like in the VET context, and what might the relevance be for international students? Would you like to answer? Andrew?
I'm happy to start. I mean, micro-credentials are probably in the VET context is really about skill sets. So it's about, wrapping sets of skills around particular outcomes in either industry or employment-specific skill sets. So sometimes their skill sets might be around, and having studied some of them myself, might be around team leader skill sets. And that just gives you a short, sharp, I guess, training and environment that provides two things. One is it enhances your focus on those skill sets where you might know, but just gives you access to some learning around that, access to resources so you can continue to reference back. But what I find most critical about the VET environment is it also provides you a network of like-minded people that can become your resources and can be also links to develop that or continue those skills post your training environment. I think that's one of the key strengths of your learning environment is when you create those networks and resources for the ongoing learning. And so micro-credentials in the TAFE sector is really represented around skill sets like that. The recently announced federal government mission around infection control training skill sets is another example of, I guess, micro-credentials where one, you can have the confidence that it's nationally recognised, accredited, and the people who deliver those will be audited to deliver a high standard of that skill set. But you're also not necessarily investing for 3 to 5 years in your learning around that particular topic. So it will become a really critical part of learning into the future because Brett's right. In times of uncertainty, you're going to go back to sort of rebuild your stock of your assets through training. And multiple skill sets, or even the opportunity to be able to indicate to future employers that you have the capacity and interest in continuing to develop your skills or modernising your skills I often talk about, is going to be really critical. So I think that's the other part. People need to understand that I guess VET has been doing shorter skill training than sort of the higher education sector for a long time. But those periods of training are going to be even shorter around short online courses, blended workshops, a bit of online with some activation activities, and skill sets will be absolutely critical for the future of the economy. And international students should equally be considering how to utilise those. That will require some, I guess, modern thinking from the regulators as to how do they incorporate and allow international students to access skill sets, the conditions around full-time training and etc. that are requirements under the ELICOS Act will need to be, I guess, reimagined to ensure international students can have access to these type of skill sets, particularly when they're not full-time. So that will require a little bit of work from the whole sector to ensure that international students have the best access to those type of opportunities that are clearly available to the domestic students and for all students will be an important part of the puzzle for the future.
Oh, thanks, Andrew. What about in your sector, Brett, like in English schools? How does it affect international students?
Yeah, it's I guess I think Andrew's probably provided a really great cross industry response in terms of the different types. It's been interesting because micro-credentialing hasn't necessarily been part of the discussion with English language delivery, but to pick up on Andrew's point, what we've seen is over this past period, many students offshore and wanting to still continue to study whilst they haven't been able to arrive in Australia on their student visa, or indeed the pipeline of future students that may not have a student visa yet, but are still interested in coming to study here in Australia. And so again, with the adaptation throughout this period, we've seen providers look at the future learn platforms and start to offer short course programs on those through those initiatives that Austrade and other organisations have led. We've seen that providers have developed their own sort of short course, I guess, learning and development programs, so that whilst the student hasn't necessarily been able to come and arrive and commence their English language course, they are still undertaking study, and that study will still equip them for when they arrive or continue into a full course more proper. So it's not necessarily been that the curriculum has been decompartmentalised in terms of micro-credentialing, but I think there has definitely been innovation in the way students are able to gain access to parts and pieces of the language development from our education training providers.
Thank you, Brad. Now, in relation to micro-credentials, I think there's a talk about accelerated apprenticeships and as a pathway to gaining trade qualification over a short time. So how could this be modeled to support international students, as you guys have said, looking to both study and work in Australia? Andrew?
I think that concept around that accelerated apprenticeships is based off the very successful model in Australia around trade apprenticeships, which obviously at this period international students aren't able to access, but is a great example of that partnership between industry and employment, where you are in employment, but part of your employment is your continuing ongoing learning. Generally in the traditional trades environment, that's a 3 to 4 year partnership between employer and trainee and trainee. But to identify areas, particularly around immediate skills needs, where that can be fast tracked, certainly speaks to a better outcome for students. And what I guess when it comes to the regulation and the access to that is where all parties, governments, and I think it's a great reminder the important role that CISA plays is to be an exclusively an international student voice in this conversation. There are lots of stakeholders, and they all need to be, I guess, understood. But the use of an organisation like CISA to be very clear and specific about one of those key stakeholders is really critical, because then their message doesn't get modified from their perspective. So, but to answer your core question, any sort of opportunity that's going to ensure people can have the right level of training as part of their employment for the benefit of themselves and for the benefit of the industry will need to be having a greater focus. I'm not sure how the recently announced sort of new skills reform and the job trainer work package will operate in a context of international students, but it does talk to a national understanding that we need to have greater clarity of the connection and I guess the purpose of investing in training for a genuine outcome, and to ensure that outcome is going to be going to work for all parties, where those industries might be and where they might be targeted to start. We'll probably speak a lot to what are the future industry needs that our economy, I guess, exclusively will have, and I guess that will also reflect what other economies will look to have as well. And I think it's interesting to reflect on recent SBS News article around 11 out of the 12 sought after required careers into the future require vet training. 31 out of 50 highest paid occupations in Australia can be done through vet training. And so it is another example of, I guess, the ability for vets traditionally, and as you talk about future apprenticeships looking like this, to offer a sort of a fast track but a mutually beneficial pathway to outcomes, particularly if it is around employment.
Thanks, Andrew. Any thoughts on that, Brett?
I think it well encapsulated with Andrew's response. Happy to take it.
Thanks. Well, with this all ideas and sort of thoughts that could actually be inevitable for the sector for its future, will Australia be supportive of the changes that will take for this vet sector, and will international students be part of this future? Brett?
Yeah, great. Absolutely. I think that I think Australia has demonstrated its commitment to international education for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and that continues to grow. Where things are at the moment, through, I guess, the government and the Council for International Education, which is the main sort of governing body, which has both government representation as well as stakeholder representation. CISA is obviously an important member of that council as well. They are going through a process where the next phase will be to look at Australia's next national strategy for international education. And that's been a commitment from our current education minister to not just renew what was existing and to be honest has served us fairly well, but to look at where we need to reposition the pillars of international education for Australia moving forward. The student centeredness of that, I think, is going to be critical. The way in which that aligns with the needs of the Australian economy more broadly coming out of this period, I think, is going to be paramount. One of the things that we continue to try and work on across different stakeholder groups, be it from the peak body groups, be it from the students and the student voices as peak bodies, and through government, is to look at the ways in which international education is really woven into, I guess, the more of the fabric of Australian society, and how do we communicate the benefits of that more broadly. Aligning some of the interests of students, be it through employment opportunities here in Australia or at home, I think has to be critical. So I guess to your point, do I think that it would, do I think that the role of international students in the acceptance will be within the future? I think it's only going to increase. For Australia, during this time, there's going to be really important decisions that need to be made on both macroeconomic level for Australia domestically, but our international trade relationships and the way in which we can cultivate communities within Australia that include the really valuable contribution of our students here as students and beyond, that has to be part of the future thinking.
You want to add something onto that, Andrew?
Oh, I don't want to make this a Brett Black Appreciation Society, but certainly he's summed up the different parties that have clearly already indicated that this conversation will occur, and is a positive conversation that can occur. And there were many different peak bodies and the opportunity for, I guess, individuals to be part of those conversations. And I guess I repeat my comment a little bit earlier around the important role that CISA can play in that conversation. I mean, at the end of the day, Australia's clearly demonstrated that we're a very well-regarded destination for education, and education for skills outcomes. So, I think there will be some really sharper messages around, the very direct skills and employment outcomes that you can get, rather than necessarily just some of the other bits that come with education in Australia, partly because that's going to be dictated by the students saying we need to have some clarity about our investment. But there's no doubt that international students will continue to play an important part of that puzzle, because we have a whole series of reasons, not only just within our own economy and our own employment sector, to continue to have, to encourage the best skilled people to be working in this country, but also because of our significant partnerships with many countries around our co-investment in the development of their economies, or the skill sets that deliver outcomes in their countries. So I think we can talk to both sides of the groups of students that look to Australia for training, those who work as part of a migration or employment outcome in this country, and those who want to have world-renowned skills to be able to be a citizen that can be employed across the world and or in their own country. So for that reason itself, it is obvious that Australia will. We're not going to do that, but you don't just need to hear myself or Brett talk about it. You can see from all the messages around Job Trainer, the International Council, the role that CISA plays at a seat at that table. The reimagining of the international education strategy being brought forward, to having a new clear focus. All those messages from the federal government to state governments to education institutions should give a lot of confidence to international students that they will play an important part in that puzzle.
All right, thank you, Andrew. And I totally believe in that, because if you get Australian qualifications, you're totally qualified in other countries. You don't really have, like, for me, I'm from the Philippines. So I came here because I need that qualification that I can be employed, not just in Australia, but in other parts of the world, like Canada or the US. So it's really great that Australia is one of those pillars in the world today with regards to education and in the vet sector. I actually have a question here from our audience today, and I think Andrew already answered that, but this is for Brett. Do you see vet sector as a pathway to gain future employment in Australia? I mean, based on your what sector you are in, does finishing vet studies allow time or visa to gain work experience after graduation for an international student?
Yep. Okay, and just to preface, so within English language and in English Australia, we are mainly focused on ensuring the proficiency and the support of students, whether they want to come and undertake English language study as a standalone course to return home and seek employment, or pathwaying through to further study here in Australia. And importantly, for students that are on student visas, around 30 to 35% of all of those students would undertake English language as well. And I guess that's the interrelationship between the two. In terms of our frameworks for employment, I think that there's still, I think opportunities within the way our post-study work program works to ensure that if a student is seeking that experience of work within Australia but still returning home, historically we have seen some limitations in terms of the way vocational students through different programs have had access to equivalent opportunities to tertiary students, mainly due to the duration of different study programs. I think that there's an opportunity for that to be re-envisioned, I'll be honest, moving forward. But I do know that some of those policy decisions they're complex. Now, our education legislation, I guess, has been written to really govern the extent to which we want to make sure our education delivery is first class and globally renowned, and that all of the acts that govern it are student-centred in terms of their approach and how providers need to work on making sure we deliver quality experiences for students. And that sits very separate from what our employment opportunities are. And so while sometimes I think students and indeed stakeholders would like to see a clearer alignment between the two, I think we do need to really recognise that in our current landscape, permanent residency requirements and those to meet permanent residency or temporary residency versus education sit within different remits. On a personal level, I do think that there is an opportunity to look at the way in which qualified international students coming through vocational education can meet the skills needs of Australia. I think that that's something that we need to be working towards. But as it stands at the moment, through this current period, and I think one statement I'd like to note on that is, the Australian government has validated its commitment to students by wanting to ensure that no student is impacted by restrictions and issues that have been faced, particularly if they were eligible for post-study work and still at home or not being able to turn back. We're anxiously waiting on the announcement around the student visa package, which will, I'm hoping, include greater clarity on how students that have been impacted by the COVID-related experience won't be disadvantaged in the future. But there are a lot of strong advocates across the student sphere and peak body sphere that are working towards ensuring that students have all the opportunities available to them.
All right, thank you, Brett. That's really insightful. On to our last question for both of you. How can we improve? Well, I think you've answered this, but in a broader sector, how can we improve our marketability for vocational education abroad in the next decade? Like to be in par and more competitive. Andrew?
Oh, well, you're right. We have touched on a little bit, but I guess some of the key things is about giving greater visibility to the student, or in some respects to international agents as well, who often are the messenger, or even the competence the students has to make those decisions. To ensure there's a direct connection between what their goals are and what the vet training environment can provide. So whether it be, we talked about before, the internationalisation of the qualification that they might have in Australia to enable them to to have enhanced employment opportunities within their country or other countries needs to be very clear, and particularly where those areas of employment are very practical by nature. There's obviously a lot of reasons why a vet environment will be able to provide you that possibly even more clearly than a higher education provider, and also often in a period that's going to be a shorter time frame to achieve that. For those who are looking to to do training as part of migration or to recognise skills and employment in Australia, clearly the links to the skills lists that are either nationally available or might be state and territory related. It does talk, as Brett said before, to the visa conditions of the country at the time, of our country at the time, but a greater understanding of how your vet training can deliver into those skill sets. And as I mentioned before, when we know a large range of the employment options in Australia can be achieved through vet training, and 11 out of the 12, sought after careers currently are vet training related or can be achieved through vet training. Probably some clarity around that message to the ultimate customer will assist in, I guess, the marketability of that. Then people can make greater decisions around affordability and time and commitment. So I do think time commitment, if it can be to achieve the same outcomes at a shorter time commitment, clearly will assist some people around the affordability questions as well. So that's some of the challenges. The other messages is obviously about how do we work with government directly, and this is probably a space as much for the public sector as it is for the private sector. How do we work directly with government to ensure sort of the onshore training in Australia of citizens from overseas, but then they return as, I guess, either pre-employed or like the apprenticeship model we have in Australia. There could be an apprenticeship model with the offshore training that can occur in Australia for apprentices in government or in the private sector of another country. So I think understanding those partnerships better and being very focused, as Brett talks about as well, to understand the customer needs will ensure that, I guess, vet is probably utilised more efficiently. And I think a lot of students, as we find in the domestic environment, can see the value of the vet environment more directly achieving their employment outcomes than possibly, for many people, a higher education option in the first instance.
Thank you, Andrew. How would you like to add on that, Brad?
I think the one last comment, globally, students have choice in their destination, and I think that Australia needs to ensure that the quality of our education delivery remains the highest it can be. The student experience, you're our greatest advocates, and the way in which your experience here in Australia leads you to a quality outcome and employment, I think, has got to be at the heart of it. And within those things, making sure our learning environments are safe and supportive, and to Andrew's points, our qualifications are transportable and highly regarded. I think if we can tick those things off and make sure that the student experience is well recognised, then we'll be well placed.
Thank you, Brett. And I do have another question here from one of our audience, Mercy. Her question is, I've realized some private vet providers don't offer quality education. I wonder why are they still in the market? Is there a way to complain about it? Andrew? Yes,
so all the vocational training providers in Australia are regulated by by ASQA, the Australian Standards Quality Authority from the federal government, and I've sent, I think, directly the link to the ASQA website, and I guess I would strongly encourage if students are having poor experiences with their provider and they're not satisfied with the response they're getting from their provider, strongly encourage them to use ASQA. For those people who live in this world, there have been a number of private providers over the journey that have been removed or had their provider status removed, or they've had to make major modifications to the delivery from ASQA audits. ASQA does audit the industry on a regular basis, but will target those audits based on feedback from customers, industry or students. So again, I wouldn't strongly encourage students to use that service. If they feel like they can't use that service directly, then an organisation like CISA is perfectly placed to be able to support a student through that journey if it's not obvious how their institution can support them in the first instance.
Thank you, Andrew. Would you like to add on that, Brett?
No, I think it's spot on.
Thank you. Well, any last thoughts, guys, for the future of VET or re-envisioning of the VET sector? Brett?
No, well, I think that, you know, if anything, the current environment has showed a resilience of our community, our education community, you know, from students to providers and those working all around the system. So re-envisaging it, I think in some ways, not losing our foundations, the indicators that were in place around certainly student satisfaction for their experience in Australia, employability rates, access to post-study work and other other employment opportunities whilst studying as well, I think are really good pillars that we need to accept and learn from. Re-envisaging it is probably those things at the start, you know, using some of the opportunity that's been created out of, you know, flexibility in designing courses, some more digital and virtual ways in which we can deliver our courses, but ultimately aligning it to employment outcomes, which is, I think, not new, but looking to where that will be in the future is going to be critical.
Andrew, any last words? I think I 100% agree with what Brett's saying is, you know, the VET environment is about that interconnectedness with the next step on your journey. It isn't sort of a standalone activity, and this will just ensure that the VET environment continues to do that. And I guess our challenge is to make sure that more and more people understand, you know, the value and the opportunity, particularly international students. It represents a really small component for international students of the training environment that's in the international education sector in Australia, and I think that's probably a bit of a lost opportunity for a whole range of students. There's no doubt a really critical place for higher education to play in the education of international students, but I also believe, particularly, you know, around the skills lists and the skills needs that our country and other countries will have, and providing people that about the practical and I guess the human networks of industry, yeah, which is co-designed or co-delivered within the curriculum of the programs, should be seen as an even greater asset in this sort of economically uncertain time. And if you want to provide greater confidence around your pathway, you know, to employment, whether, as I said, whether it be within Australia or outside Australia, you know, people should think about VET for a little bit longer. And I think that's also about international agents also being open to understanding the needs of the student in this context today. And I guess I strongly encourage students who aren't having that experience or have lessons that have been learned that the sector could improve from, share those with the sector, share those through CISA. People like Brett, myself and Troy and others are very keen to hear that student experience, because at the end of the day, if we're not achieving outcomes for students, the sector becomes smaller. So, and I think my other sort of general message, not just about the VET sector, is there are actually a lot of resources around to support. And I think we've learnt that from the pandemic. What we've also learnt is the connectedness for people to be able to access those on a seamless basis hasn't been as great as we would like, and particularly for international students. So I think the message for me is there is a whole range of additional supports, whether it be institute specific or can be accessed by the institute, knowing where the community agencies, governments and otherwise can provide that support. So I'd strongly encourage students to continue to ask questions and to sort of seek out that support, because it is there. Sometimes the challenge is that the message isn't being received in the most effective way for the customer. Then we probably need some help from the customer as well to help us ensure that we are delivering those outcomes, because all the sector is very keen to make sure the customer has an amazing outcome and an amazing experience in training in Australia. Sometimes where there are gaps, we need some assistance in getting that student voice or the customer experience voice to help us keep, ensure that that continues to happen at the best possible level. And I think that's a challenge we had pre-COVID-19, but COVID-19 has sort of highlighted just how critical that is, and I guess how, if it's not addressed in the best possible way and regularly and currently updated, then it's not always going to provide the best experience, which then leads to those messages around how, Australia as a destination and or VET as a destination within Australia for training and education.
Thank you, guys. I really like that insights that coming from you guys, and I really am excited for the future of the vet sector, to be honest. And I believe that it is the future for international students here in Australia, and to gain the skills and those knowledge, like for trade and for what, and actually can apply it in their life for life skills. It's really important that Australia is giving focus onto it, and as I've heard from you, that the government is working on new schemes or new updates with regards to visa and stuff to accommodate these changes and with whatever happened with COVID-19. Thank you so much. Again, guys, I would like to remind you later today at 1 p.m. We have a Focus on Volunteers Today, Leaders Tomorrow. Join us in a fun and interactive session by registering in the link on the conference page, or you can find the link in your Zoom chat box. So see you there. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. And with our speakers, Brett Wacker, CEO of English Australia, and Andrew Scotford, the General Manager of Canberra Institute of Technology. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.